This episode is made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support this channel, join our Discord server, and get early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. I've heard from some of you that my videos don't have great replayability value, so I've decided that in an effort to get you to come back and rewatch this video, I'm gonna read a random sequence of numbers you're definitely going to forget and will therefore need to come back to at a later date. Pretty clever, huh? They don't call me Mr. YouTube for nothing. I'm the only one actually innovating on this dying platform. Anyway, here we go with the unforgettable, forgettable content. 54, 609, 324, 8, 420, and another 420, and another. Wait a minute. How's it going? In this episode, we're talking about drug legalization and decriminalization. It's a massive topic, one that could easily snowball into a stupidly long video essay, like, I don't know, over 15 minutes long or something. Ah, dang it. This can't keep happening. Anyway, we're talking about drugs and drug legalization. Here in the business, we call these kinds of videos gimmies. They're easy to make, convincing, and they usually all go like this. 1. We should decriminalize drugs. 2. Look at how bad the war on drugs is. It's expensive, it's ineffective, racist, violent, etc. 3. Look at Portugal or some other country where decriminalization and legalization works really well. And 4. There is no fourth step, it really is that easy. Legalizing and decriminalizing drugs is a gimme. Drugs can have very serious side effects. Every drug does to some extent, including the already legal ones. But numerous studies, real-world policy choices, and just being a little compassionate and understanding that being addicted to something shouldn't be treated like going on a murderous rampage and punished with decades of imprisonment, all demonstrate that the legalization of comparatively safe drugs like marijuana, the decriminalization of every other drug, yes, literally every other drug, and harm reduction policies like needle disposal stations, supervised injection sites, and voluntary treatment are good things when it comes to reducing the impact drugs have on our societies and our fellow humans. We can, with relatively high confidence, conclude that this public health and harm reduction approach leads to fewer people having a harmful relationship with drug usage, a drop in mortality rates due to drug use, lower rates of HIV and AIDS transmission, less incarceration, which we could definitely use in this country, undermining criminal networks with an involvement in the drug trade, destigmatizing drug users, and for a lot of addicts or simple recreational users, consumption is just less stressful, more enjoyable, and safer, which also has to count for something. A lot of good comes from treating drug usage as a public health issue and not a criminal issue, including the goals advocates of the war on drugs say they themselves have. For example, getting drugs out of kids' hands and helping those kids have a more stable future. If in some places the recreational use of cannabis goes up in the general population, it usually only does a little. Harmful use goes down. On the other side of things, the war on drugs has made drugs themselves worse. Potency goes up when you're pushing drugs underground and into the hands of smugglers who are dealing with limited space and weight requirements, increasing the risk of overdose. And the constant competition for cheaper drugs means the illicit sector ends up cutting quote-unquote clean drugs with harmful additives, which for obvious reasons aren't usually disclosed to the person consuming them. Both of these trends can increase the chance of death or serious health problems with drug consumption, which is, bad. It's not always perfect, and in all fairness, some of the positive data we have is more correlational than certified causal. But drug legalization and depenalization is undeniably better than what we're currently doing by a mile. We elite YouTubers and guardians of all knowledge make these videos because in just a couple minutes, you can get a very clear idea of the benefits of legalization and decriminalization and why we should absolutely do it. Wanting a more free society, reducing the impact of drugs, and resolving the wrongs of a useless war are all good things, and make these videos and the policies they promote really attractive. Fact checkers and people who like specific percentages, sources are in the description. But I'm hoping this video can be a little different and go a bit deeper. Not just because I know that you already agree, you little drug legalizing rascal you, but because this is a super interesting political topic with a lot of depth to it. A lot more than the strict policy framework of moving something from one list to another. Let's take ourselves a little less seriously this week, relax, and just talk about the intersection of drugs and politics for a little while, covering some interesting aspects of the topic without trying too hard to make an ironclad, one-dimensional argument. This video is going to be less argumentative and more exploratory than my videos usually are, so get ready for that. Because the reality of human history is that we went from a world where drugs were just another part of life to a world where drugs became deeply embedded in our global power structures, often for the worse. How did we get there? Let's go way back. Drugs, meaning substances we introduce to our bodies for non-nutritional purposes, have existed all around the world and pop up pretty much everywhere in pretty much every era, used in religious ceremonies, for medicinal purposes, and recreationally, to the extent that these three things can even be clearly separated. The various drugs we still know today, like cannabinoids, opiates, cocaine, nicotine, and caffeine, all have some record of being used by humans several thousand years ago in countless places around the world, wherever the plants that produced them grow. Thanks to a ton of work by all sorts of scientists, we've got a really impressive record of different cultural uses for all sorts of drugs spanning thousands and thousands of years and miles. Even a cursory general history of which can't possibly fit into a couple minutes of a YouTube video when you consider just how many drugs there are today, how many there have been in the past, and how widespread their uses became at various points in history. At the risk of sounding like a Vice reporter with a culturally appropriated tattoo, historically speaking, human existence is drug use. Today, that statement isn't necessarily controversial, but at least a little unexpected, like still liking Hamilton. And the reason saying human lives are deeply tangled with drug use sounds weird is that the human relationship with drugs has dramatically changed in the last 1,000 or so years. Predictably, colonialism and the industrialization of drug consumption are some of the biggest reasons for that change. Because today, highly industrialized countries like the US and the UK are countries where drug laws are some of the strictest in the world. In the US alone, somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 people are in jail for drug offenses, which, while I'm here, research shows that higher rates of imprisonment don't reduce drug consumption. Anyway, despite their very policey current policies, the history of these two countries is one of tremendous drug promotion everywhere around the globe. Believe the posters in your college dorm and those t-shirts at tourist shops. Uncle Sam really did want people to get blasted on the reg. The story of the British Empire and the Chinese Opium Wars is the classic example here. For over 100 years, Britain sold opium to China, tactically flooding their market illegally and eventually fighting 2 wars with the country to force open trade relations and expand the reach of Britain's power. In search of bigger markets, more access to goods to bring back to whatever the British equivalent of stateside is, and thanks to that classic British desire for colonial subordination, drugs at the hands of the empire proved to be an incredibly effective instrument of power. Opium was so good at helping Britain do a war that it went ahead and did it twice, getting China to concede by opening ports of trade all across its coast and ceding large amounts of territory like the still British not that long ago Hong Kong. But Britain isn't the only country that gets to have fun playing drug war games. During the Cold War, the US adopted the same stance all across the world. In France and Italy, the CIA aided strikebreakers and the Italian mafia to try to suppress communist organizing, eventually bolstering these groups in their ability to dominate domestic and American heroin markets. In many different parts of Asia, opium profits were used to fund anti-communist and nationalist armies, and some of the product was kicked on over to them boys in green in that there Vietnam, so they could get a taste of that devilish smack. But these two examples are relatively minor footnotes in the history of drug-related interventionism by the US and the CIA. The bulk of US work still remembered today is in Latin America. Let's set the stage for a second. The US elects famed voice actor of the hit film The Amazing Dr. Clitterhouse to be president one more time just to get it out of their system. Unluckily for him, Reagan's not allowed to go do every single thing he wants, like arm dictators in Iran and fund right-wing militias in Nicaragua. Luckily for him, though, he can use the sneaky political trick of doing it anyway, massively increasing the scale of drug trafficking in the process and destabilizing a whole continent. All the while, of course, being the voice behind the American hit, the Just Say No campaign. Using arms sales in Iran, illegal at the time because of an embargo, by the way, Reagan funneled funds to anti-communist rebel networks in Nicaragua, which, surprise surprise, made their money through the drug trade. At the same time the US was promoting the growth of illicit drugs through Contra networks, it was simultaneously promoting the industrialization of its legal production in the pharmaceutical sector. US drug companies started gaining power in Latin America, and laid their claim to parts of the drug cultivation and refining economy. The US delineated what it deemed to be justified uses for drug plants like coca, and then imposed its industrial sector to profit off this regulatory permit it had practically issued itself, setting up chains of neocolonial exploitation in the process. This double movement allowed even more US intervention. Back home, this was done by fearmongering about the threat of drugs on our children, and the need for the US to stop the flow, quote, at the source, which really meant sending American troops, intelligence, and flexing the US's economic power at whatever countries the US didn't like. The illicit drug economy was brutally repressed, and the arbitrarily legal side of the drug economy was expanded. In its public messaging, the US made the connection between terror groups and the drug trade, leaving out the part where they were funding those same terror groups and trying to whitewash their image back home, while at the same time, the US used its economic and geopolitical power once more to start creating international drug policy, setting up institutions and treaties that would draw clear and arbitrary lines between legal and illegal drug production and consumption in ways that would conveniently allow it to punish its domestic population and that of foreign countries to the degree it saw fit. And that would allow its own industries to develop quickly, while other American countries lagged behind, cut off from the same markets. Here, too, control over drug production was used as a way to expand capitalist markets and subordinate foreign nations. But it doesn't end there. All over the world, introducing drug consumption was used tactically to both expand the reach of capitalist nations on the industrial side and institute capitalist modes of production on the societal side in places where those drugs didn't exist before, or at least not in quite the way the US presented them. Drugs, because of their capacity for addiction, were introduced, weaponized, and placed behind price barriers, meaning that if you want drugs now, you need to buy them, in order to create new labor forces willing to work for wages, both at the individual and the national scale. Drugs helped create wage labor in parts of the world, and when we talk about the history of capitalist expansion, that often gets brushed aside. Over time, the drugs that became associated with productivity, like tobacco and caffeine, escaped prohibitionary regimes, as did incredibly popular and profitable drugs like alcohol and medicinal drugs, fluctuating over time as new and more potent iterations of the same drug entered into circulation. For the drugs outside these categories, the use of narcotics for leisure became closely associated with sin, anti-sociability, and all sorts of other bad things. Even today, we have a hard time justifying drug legalization in the public sphere without resorting to medical arguments, touting the psychological benefits of psilocybin or the pain treatment virtues of marijuana. It can't simply be the case that some drugs, when properly handled, regulated, and used, can just be a fun thing. Part of the reason for that is that we have stigmatized some drug use incredibly harshly, appropriately in some cases, but undeniably excessively in others. And look, I'm not saying you should run out and go do drugs. If I'm being honest, they're not really my thing. And if you're young in particular, and I know a lot of my audience is, the harmful effects of drugs go double for you. A brain that is still changing as much as yours won't love the kinds of baggage drugs bring with them in ways that can affect you pretty severely over time. But we can still recognize how dramatic some of the discourse surrounding drug use has gotten. Back to the politics side of things. Look, we've made progress on drug policies. Even some conservatives are turning over a new leaf, so to speak, about harm reduction strategies and a health-first approach to drug use, which is really good. No conservative today is still seriously beating the drum of the war on drugs or stupidly thinks that harm reduction strategies are, I don't know, the worst of coddling culture combined with victim ideology, combined with kind of a hatred of civilization.
This is the worst of coddling culture combined with victim ideology, combined with kind of a hatred of civilization.
Well, heck. Okay, so we're not quite there yet. Look, if you have to take anything from my long rambling about drugs and politics, let it be this. Drugs have a long, very interesting history in human society. We are at a point today where we aren't going to be in either a drug-free society, nor a place where we can consume drugs with reckless abandon. We can use the scientific discoveries we've already made to enjoy some drugs responsibly, and should urge our governments to allow for greater scientific inquiry to both make sure that's actually the case, and learn more about the drugs we still consider taboo. We can do all this by recognizing that the role of drugs in our history is complex, ever-changing, and is often a corollary of who has power in a society. Today, with so many people imprisoned on drug charges, it's clear where that power lies. If we want to get to a society where we all share power equally, a democracy, if you will, we are going to need to change our relationship with drugs too. It's going to need to be one of deeper understanding, greater freedom, and greater compassion, not one of constantly escalating violence, punishment, and repression. Nobody wants someone's life to be ruined by drug use. Making sure that drug use doesn't get you thrown in jail, stop you from landing a job, and that you can get access to proper treatment if you want to is the way to do that. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help me produce more like it, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. When I made the switch to producing political content, most of my sponsors bailed. It's understandable, but it also means I've been having to rely more heavily on viewers like you. If you appreciate the work I'm doing and are able to chip in even $1 a month, I would greatly appreciate your support. As a little show of that appreciation, every patron, regardless of donation amount, gets early access to every video, plus access to our patrons-only Discord server. It's a great place to hang out, and we've also got a recommended reading list, a book club, and I try to do a live Q&A session every month or so. So if you'd like to help support my channel, join the Discord, and get early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. It really does help keep this channel afloat. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous videos by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.